Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to welcome you all here today at the United Nations at the Open Area Formula meeting under the title Humanitarian Aspects of Missing and Captive Persons in Gaza. I thank you very much for your participation. We have co-organized this area meeting with the sole humanitarian purpose to attract attention of the Council and the wider UN membership to the often neglected real human side of the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, missing persons, regardless of their status, soldiers falling or captured during the fighting, or civilians taken captive by an adverse party, are protected by humanitarian law. Intentionally withholding information about missing persons is acting in violation of humanitarian law. That's what the International Committee of the Red Cross says. Therefore, we consider the tragic story of Second Lieutenant Hadar Goldin and Staff Sergeant Oron Shaul, who were killed in the line of duty in 2014 during the Gaza Strip escalation, and whose remains have not been returned to their families, to be an acute humanitarian issue that needs to be addressed. Even the mere fact that it took so long to address it here at the United Nations reflects the complexity of the wider negative trends characterizing the current status of the Middle East peace process. I hope that this area meeting will serve an opportunity for all member states to tackle this issue. It is my pleasure now to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations, Ambassador Michelle Sisson. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Yelchenko, and it is good to be here this morning with all of you and with Dr. Golden and Professor Kotler. In May of this year, U.S. Special Representative for International Negotiations, Jason Greenblatt, met with the Golden and Shaul families and shared his outrage at Hamas terrorist organization's callous desire to hold IDF Lieutenant Hadar Goldin and IDF Staff Sergeant Oron Shaul's remains for political advantage. We share Mr. Greenblatt's outrage at Hamas's actions. These families are not alone. In November, the White House welcomed the Mengistu family and expressed sympathy for the capture of their son, Avraham. Avraham was seized by Hamas 3 years ago and has been held without the opportunity to contact his family or access medical care. Hamas also continues to hold another Israeli citizen, Hisham al-Sayed, under similar conditions. Hisham entered Gaza 7 months after Avraham. Both men reportedly suffer from mental illness. The United States wishes to commend and convey its deepest sympathies to the Golden, Shaul, Mengistu, and al-Sayed families for their resilience in the face of Hamas's actions. We believe that the families are owed updates on the health and status of the prisoners. In both these cases and others in the past, Hamas's prisoners are treated as bargaining chips. This is against accepted practice and the basic dignity of the prisoners. The United States renews its calls to Hamas to return the remains of the IDF soldiers, Hadar Goldin and Oron Shaul, as well as Israeli civilians, Avraham Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed, to their families immediately. Today, along with members of the Israeli mission, our Ukrainian colleagues, and other concerned member states, we greatly appreciate hearing this morning from Dr. Golden and Professor Kotler in a few moments on how the international community can work together on solutions to this ongoing tragedy. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me briefly introduce today's panelists. Dr. Leah Golden, the mother of Second Lieutenant Hadar Goldin, an Israeli soldier who fell in battle in August 2014. and Mr. Irwin Kotler, who is the founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former member of Parliament, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and an international human rights lawyer. I now give the floor to Dr. Leah Golden.
Ambassador Volodymyr Yelchenko, Ambassador Michel Sisson, distinguished members of the Security Council. My name is Leah Golden. I'm a mother of 4, grandmother of 5, a wife of an historian and a computer scientist myself. I speak before you today as the mother of Lieutenant Hadar Goldin, an Israeli soldier who died at the age of 23 while defending his country, and whose remains are held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, along with another fallen soldier, Staff Sergeant Oron Shaul, and along with 2 Israeli civilians, Avraham Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed. From June 1st through July 7, 2014, nearly 450 missiles were fired upon Israeli civilians by extremist organizations based in Gaza. To end this reign of terror attacks, Israel commenced Operation Protective Edge, which was intended to put an end to the missile terror and shut down the underground tunnels that Hamas had dug in order to penetrate Israeli civilian centers. On July 18, a ground phase of the operation began, and our 2 sons, Hadar and his twin brother Tzur, both officers in elite combat units of the Israeli Defense Forces, entered Gaza with their units. Hadar's unit was responsible for protecting the engineering units that were working under fire to destroy these terror tunnels. Tzur, Hadar's twin brother, commanded a rescue company whose job was to rescue wounded or dead Israeli soldiers. Tzur also rescued Palestinian families who were caught in the crossfire as Hamas used them as human shields. During the first 50 days of Operation Protective Edge, Israel agreed to a number of ceasefires. You all are welcome to go back and check. Almost all of these were broken by Hamas. Finally, on August 1st, 2014, Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire proposal that was jointly brokered by the United Nations and the United States. Less than 2 hours after Hamas agreed to this ceasefire, its terrorists emerged from a tunnel located under the basement of a house in Rafah and ambushed our son Hadar and 2 other Israeli soldiers. The terrorists killed 2 of the soldiers and shot Hadar, dragging him into the tunnel in order to commit a kidnapping. Unsure at that point if Hadar was dead or alive, the IDF attempted to rescue him. Tzur, his twin brother, actually got the call to rescue Hadar. But at that time, Tzur did not yet know that his twin brother had been the soldier who had been shot and hijacked. Tragically, Israeli military forces were unsuccessful in bringing Hadar back. 36 hours later, according to forensic evidence found inside the tunnel, the IDF declared Hadar dead. Let us be perfectly clear about what happened. Hamas publicly promised the United Nations and the US that it would honor the humanitarian ceasefire while sending terrorists through tunnel to ambush Israeli soldiers when they had let their guard down in light of the ceasefire. Hamas' intention was not only to kill Israeli soldiers under cover of a ceasefire, but to kidnap them as well in order to hold them hostage. This is why they snatched Hadar after the attack and dragged him back to Gaza into the tunnel. This act of terror by Hamas took advantage of ceasefire sponsored by this organization, the United Nations. It was a cynical and cold-blooded violation of all principles that this organization cherishes. Let me be clear, this is not a subjective interpretation of the events. Immediately after Hamas violation of the ceasefire, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon released an official statement saying that he condemns in the strongest terms the reported violation by Hamas of a mutually agreed humanitarian ceasefire. He said that he is shocked and profoundly disappointed by these developments. He stressed that the acts of Hamas constitute a grave violation of the ceasefire. He added that such moves call into question the credibility of Hamas assurances to the United Nations and demanded the immediate and unconditional release of the captured soldiers. The U.S. response to Hamas treachery was similar, with both President Obama and the Secretary of State Kerry condemning the attack and demanding immediate and unconditional return of Adar. So let's agree that when Hamas killed my son and kidnapped his body, no war was going on. Everyone in this room, in this building, understands perfectly well the difference between waging war in accordance with international standards and acting cold-heartedly, cruelly, inhuman. We all know the difference between maintaining a humanitarian ceasefire sponsored by the United Nations and cynically exploiting it to murder and kidnap. We are not the first Israeli parents to lose a beloved child in combat in defense of our country, and sadly, we will not be the last. However, we do suffer a different sort of pain because our son was not a victim of the war in Gaza, but a victim of the ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire, brokered and sponsored by United Nations. What happened after Adar was killed, and kidnapped, what happened after the leader of the United Nations condemned Adar and called for his immediate return? Nothing, absolutely nothing. World leaders called for Adar's return, but Hamas merely thumbed into nose at the international community. There has been no expression of collective outrage by the member states of the United Nations calling for his return. There has been only silence, painful and brutal silence. 3.5 years later, while my son's empty grave in his own hometown awaits his return to be buried, and while my family's agony at his loss continues, not one member state has done a single deed to help us bring him home. We have received expressions of sympathy, yes. Delegates have told us how they feel for our plight, true, but the organization has not acted to right this wrong, to ease our pain. This issue goes beyond the case of my son Adar, because if Hamas is not called accountable for these acts of deception, then other unprincipled and murderous terrorist organizations and states will feel empowered to manipulate the UN in order to achieve their vicious objectives. The integrity of the United Nations stands on the line here. I will tell you why. The international community at the conference convened in October 2014 by the United Nations pledged more than $5.4 billion to rebuild Gaza. This aid package was raised in the name of Humanitarian Aid for Gaza. Hamas, the organization that violated a humanitarian ceasefire brokered by the UN, was now deemed fit to receive humanitarian aid. Not one member state raised an objective that perhaps the international community should not reward Hamas, a serial violator of the international law. Not one member state insisted that the very least that Hamas should do before receiving international aid is to return my fallen son. I gave birth to him, I raised him, I sent him to defend his country. My country obeyed your rules. I want him back. I demand to have back with him. Although the wounds from 2014 Gaza war have not yet healed, Israel permits 1,000 trucks of supplies to enter Gaza on a daily basis, providing food and medical supplies. Israel has already provided more than 1 million tons of construction materials to Gaza, and even at our time of great sorrow, we are proud of the Israeli policies on the humanitarian issues, especially in the face of Hamas cruelty. Yet, we are outraged by the fact that families in Gaza are rebuilding their lives thanks to the kindness of the global community, while our family is unable to even grieve properly. One of the fundamental rules that have been universally followed is that after a battle, each side returns the bodies of fallen soldiers. People of faith all over the world understand that it is wrong to hold hostage bodies of fallen soldiers. Islam adheres to these principles. It is well-known tradition in Islam that the Prophet himself introduced his followers to refrain from ransoming the body of a fallen opponent, inviting the enemy to come and bring its fallen soldier to proper burial. And so even the International Committee for the Red Cross has called for the return of Hadar and Doron. The reason that there is an agreement among Christianity, Islam, and Judaism on how and why the bodies of fallen soldiers should be returned for proper burial is that all faiths recognize the significance of this principle. God desires that we respect the dead and let them be buried properly by their loved ones. God desires that we desecrate the dead, to bring them home for final rest, menucha shlema, as we say in Hebrew. Holding the bodies of our fallen sons to inflict additional pain is to descend into godlessness and barbarity. I ask the member of UN Security Council to see that good people of faith throughout the world are asking the same question. Why does the United Nations tolerate this type of misconduct and these hateful entities? People of faith are looking to this organization to take action, real one, that makes it worthwhile to globally act under this international body in the name of what's right. My husband Simcha and I have suffered the most terrible tragedy that anyone can suffer, the loss of a child. This is an unbearable experience that had been made even more terribly due to the fact that we have been prevented from giving our son a proper burial, prevented from being able to grieve for him and visit him in accordance with Jewish tradition. So the pain of our loss continues, and we are unable to move on and try to recover. Hadar, my beloved son, with his unforgettable smile, his incredible paintings, and his stage writing, who showed how simple it is to love another person. Hadar, who helped those in need and set his mission in life to bring people together, religious and non-religious alike. Why is my Hadar still there, so far away from me? I miss him. Hadar left behind not only us, his grieving parents, but also his two brothers and sister, and his young nephews and nieces. And you should also know that Hadar left behind his fiancée. He was killed 30 days before he was to celebrate his marriage. Our grief and loss, as well as the grief of the parents of Oron Shaul, are all more painful because Hamas continues to hold their bodies as bargaining chip. My child's body is a political instrument? To prove what? To get what exactly? My husband Simcha and I here today not to convey a political message. We are here to ask you to be on the right side of history, to enforce humanitarianism on those who deny and ignore it, to come up and say that all are God's children, and therefore all should find peace, if not in life, then in death. We ask you to fix this injustice. As God said to Cain, in 4th chapter of Genesis, the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth. The voices of the blood of Hadar Goldin and Oron Shaul call out to this council to take action and correct this terrible wrong. To be practical, we believe that the best way to motivate Hamas to return our son is to make it clear that the reconstruction of Gaza is not unconditional. We request that you pass a resolution requiring Hamas to return the bodies of Hadar Goldin and Oron Shaul before continuing to provide humanitarian aid in Gaza. As we approach the holiday season and the beginning of the new year, we are hopeful that you take some of what had been said here along with you, take a good look at your own children, think of what they mean to you. In the end, we are all the same, human beings who were brought to this world for a limited time, who keep on living through what we live when we are gone. This is what we have, this is what we had. In sitting aside and looking the other way is a political statement, then it's the wrong one. Please keep us in your hearts. We thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leah. Thank you for sharing with us this tragic story. We fully share your feelings, of course, and please rest assured that we will do our best to address this problem again and again, no matter how many efforts it's going to take, until it's fully resolved and justice prevails. I give the floor now to our next speaker, Mr. Kotler. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairs, members of the Security Council, delegates, honorés distingués, friends, may I begin by expressing our collective appreciation for the moving and compelling remarks and message of Leah Golden. We meet today at an important moment of remembrance and reminder. In the immediate aftermath of the 69th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, known as the Magna Carta of international human rights and the foundation and cornerstone of international humanitarian law. As it happens, the originating and organizing theme for today's Security Council briefing, co-hosted, and I express my appreciation both to the delegations of the Ukraine and the United States, co-hosted under the ARIA formula, is on humanitarian aspects of missing and captive persons in Gaza. And where, as the International Committee of the Red Cross put it, and as cited by the chair in his opening remarks from Ukraine, and I quote, "Missing persons, regardless of their status, soldiers fallen or captured during the fighting, or civilians taken captive by an adverse party, are protected by humanitarian law. And where intentionally withholding information about missing persons is acting in violation of international humanitarian law. In particular, and have expressed concern to this meeting, and as a representative and co-chair from the United States has herself expressed, Hamas murdered and seized the remains of Hadar Goldin in violation of a UN-mandated humanitarian ceasefire in which the United States joined in and mediated at the time, while continuing also to hold the remains of a second murdered Israeli, Oron Shaul, and where on two other occasions Hamas captured and continues to hold Israeli civilians Abraham Mengistu and Isham al-Sayed, both mentally disabled, deprived of their liberty, and deprived of their right to be reunited with their families, the whole also respected under international humanitarian law. Accordingly, may I now summarize these foundational principles of international human rights and humanitarian law as reflected in and represented by the cases that are subject matter of our discourse this morning, and let us always remember that behind the cases are human beings and their families and the pain and suffering which they are enduring. First, the families of the deceased and the missing have a right, a fundamental right, anchored in international humanitarian law, to seek and be informed of the status and situation of their loved ones, the denial of which by Hamas is a source of ongoing pain and suffering for their families. Accordingly, as the International Committee of the Red Cross has put it, and as Leah Golden has cited in her remarks, intentionally withholding information about missing persons, as Hamas continues to do, is a standing violation of international humanitarian law. And more, the cruel taunting and torment of the Golden family about the fate of their son is not only in and of itself a standing violation of international humanitarian law, it is a cruel and mocking rebuke of this foundational humanitarian principle, even a mocking rebuke of what the United Nations stands for. Second, Hamas is not only withholding information or tauntingly dissembling that information, but continues to refuse to return the remains of Hadar Golden and Oron Shaul. Yet another and particular injurious and egregious standing violation of a foundational principle of international humanitarian law. As Jacques Maillot, the head of the Red Cross for Israel and the territories, has put it, and I quote, "Human remains must be handled with dignity, identified and returned to the families concerned." And then the crucial words of Jacques Maillot, of particular import to this meeting, and I quote, "These are among the most widely accepted rules of warfare, indeed a foundational principle of customary international law." Third, Hamas has engaged in a standing violation of fundamental precepts of human rights and human dignity, which underpin the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and which find expression in the Geneva Conventions and customary international law, including the first Geneva Convention, Article 17.3, which states that remains of the deceased must be honorably interned, thereby presupposing the obligation to return those remains to begin with, including as well Article 34 of the Additional Protocol 1 to the First Geneva Convention, stipulating that remains must be respected, and adding that there is an express obligation, and I quote, "to facilitate the return of the remains of the deceased and personal effects to the home country upon its request," requests which have gone unanswered and unaddressed. These humanitarian obligations also find expression in a cluster of customary international humanitarian law rules, and I'll just only excerpt briefly from some of them, such as Rule 104, which speaks of respect for convictions and religious practices, including the obligation to return remains for burial in accordance with the religious practices of the deceased and his family, also referenced by Leah Golden. Rule 105 of respect for family life, where the withholding of information from the family and the refusal to return the remains and personal effects of the deceased remain standing violations of international humanitarian law, underpinned as well by Rule 115, and I quote, "the dead must be disposed of in a respectful manner." Fourth principle, and of particular importance to this gathering, Hamas is also in standing violation of the agreed-upon standards of behavior and respect in the Islamic world, as set forth in Article 4 of the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, and which reads, and I quote, "Every human being is entitled to human sanctity and the protection of one's good name and honor during one's life and after one's death. The state and the society shall protect one's body and burial place from declaration." And as Leah Golden has put it, this is a universal principle, common also to Islam, to Christianity, and to Judaism. Accordingly, Hamas's standing violation of these norms of customary international law, as set forth above, is also a standing violation of international humanitarian principles of these religions. Fifth, the Palestinian Authority, as well as Hamas, is also now in standing violation of international humanitarian law. For on October 12, 2017, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority entered into a reconciliation agreement wherein the Palestinian Authority assumed jurisdiction over Gaza as well as the West Bank. Yet the PA has not condemned or remedied the withholding of information by Hamas regarding missing persons in their jurisdiction, and it has not condemned or remedied the continued refusal by Hamas to return the remains of the deceased. In a word, it not only has not held Hamas accountable, but participates in nurturing the culture of impunity surrounding these violations of international humanitarian law. Sixth, Hadar Golden, as mentioned, was murdered and his remains seized in violation of a UN-sanctioned humanitarian ceasefire, one brokered by the U.S. as well on August 1st, 2014. And where this standing violation of international humanitarian law by Hamas, regrettably aided and abetted now by the Palestinian Authority, is not only a standing violation of a UN-mandated humanitarian ceasefire, which would be bad enough, but a violation of the foundational United Nations principle to respect and protect international peace and security, evidencing thereby an abiding disrespect and denunciation of the United Nations itself, its values, its institutions, its norms, and its responsibilities. Seventh, such actions and inaction by the Palestinian Authority not only constitute a standing violation of international humanitarian law, but as the Palestinian Authority has joined the International Criminal Court and invested in it jurisdiction over crimes in the West Bank and Gaza from June 13, 2014, it is in standing violation of Article 8.2b, Section 21 of the Rome Statute. This provision, in accordance with the others that I have earlier cited, prohibits outrages upon personal dignity and, in particular, humiliating and degrading treatment, which the ICC Elements of Crimes explains applies as well to the personal dignity of a dead person, thus protecting the deceased from any indignity under this statute, the whole comporting with the compelling notion of human dignity that so underpins international humanitarian law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we have referenced today. Accordingly, Hamas, by continuing to illegally withhold the remains of Hadar Golden and that of Oren Shaul, is in standing violation of the International Criminal Court prohibition against committing outrages upon the dignity of the deceased by violating their right to internment according to their religion, itself presupposing the obligation of return of those remains for burial purposes, and where the inhumane withholding of the remains of Hadar Golden and Oren Shaul subjects the Palestinian Authority as a responsible governing party to accountability before the International Criminal Court if it does not, as it can and it must, remedy this ongoing and outrageous violation. In conclusion, as we embark upon this 70th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are witnessing a critical mass of violations of international humanitarian law and of the principles and purposes of the United Nations and its institutions designed to promote and protect these principles. The United Nations, its member states and institutions have a responsibility to protect those who are protected persons under international humanitarian law and are the subject matter of our briefing this morning, and where the United Nations, as the trustees of international humanitarian law, as the trustees of international peace and security, have a responsibility to act. My great friend and mentor, Nobel Peace Laureate Elie Wiesel, would warn of the danger of indifference and inaction in the face of evil, of our responsibility always to speak and act against injustice in the pursuit of justice, warning us always that indifference always means coming down on the side of the victimizer and not on the side of the victim, that indifference always means coming down on the side of the tormentors and not on the side of the tormented, reminding us of fidelity to the basic principles of international humanitarian law, which so inspire our gathering today, to the UN, and to combating the culture of impunity which continues to surround these violations, and as Leah Golden put it, the outrageous silence accompanying it. And so it is our responsibility to ensure that we will not be silent, that we will send a message to the families that they are not alone, that we stand in solidarity with them in their deep pain and suffering, that we will not relent until justice is secured for them and for the abiding integrity of the United Nations, and until the foundational principles of international humanitarian law are respected and secured, with the return of the remains of the deceased and the release of the missing. The whole also, as I mentioned, in the pursuit of international peace and security, and the responsibility to protect protected persons, the overriding principle in international humanitarian law. And so may this special session not only be an act of remembrance on the occasion of the beginning of the 70th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but may it also be a remembrance to act by all of us individually and collectively, and the United Nations as the trustees of remembrance and action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kotler. Thank you for your emotional yet very substantive introduction and remarks. And I think I would fully agree with you that we should make everything in order that this session will not remain only as a commemorative event. I will now give the floor to the members of the Security Council first. Please indicate by pressing the green button. And the first speaker on my list is the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Golden in particular. Colleagues, all conflicts have something in common: the politics that lie in the cause of conflict and in its resolution. And in this building, we talk a lot about politics, whether in the Council or the Assembly or in committee. And we can become immune to political arguments, and we can even see it sometimes as a game. But all conflicts have something else in common, something much more important, and that's the people at their heart. And it's hearing the personal testimony here today that is so important for all of us who work on these issues day in and day out, so that we remember the human consequences of our work and the human consequences of our failure. And our sympathies go to the families of Second Lieutenant Leah Golden and Staff Sergeant Oren Shaw, who, without the return of their remains, have been prevented, as we heard so clearly today, from being able to properly grieve, as any loved one should, as any parent should, and which is a right. The UK considers these acts of kidnap and the refusal to return remains to be a violation of international humanitarian law. They dehumanize both the victims, and it is inhumane to their families. And we call for the unconditional return of their bodies. The UK stands with Israel in solidarity against the appalling actions of Hamas, and we offer our sympathies also to the families, not only to the families of the young soldiers, but also to the families of Avrei Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed, whose whereabouts are still unknown. The UK is clear that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and one which we consider a grave threat to international security. Hamas's ongoing decision to embrace violence and reject peace lies at the heart of the tragedy in Gaza and continues to damage lives and livelihoods on both sides of the border. We strongly condemn the incitement in the Hamas-run media and education system, which contributes to a culture of hate. Hamas faces a fundamental decision about whether it is prepared to accept the Quartet principles and join efforts for peace, or whether it will continue to use violence and terror, with all the terrible consequences for the people of Gaza and for the families of these captured young men. We will continue to demand, as the Quartet principles state, that Hamas renounces violence, recognizes Israel, and accepts previous diplomatic agreements. And we call on those in the region with influence over Hamas to encourage them to do so, in the best interests of the Palestinians as well as of Israel. We welcome the return of the legitimate Palestinian Authority to Gaza as the reconciliation process progresses. It is critical that the Palestinian leadership continue their efforts to tackle terror and incitement and ensure compliance with the Quartet principles. And we hope that this can begin a renewed process towards peace and a two-state solution where a safe and secure Israel can live alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. But that's politics. And most of all, we must remember the human consequences on all sides of conflict, and in particular of conflict in the Middle East, and do all we can as member states of this organization to persuade those who have power to relieve the ongoing suffering of people around the world. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Sí. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. As a matter of fact, what I would like to stress today is that since this is one of the last meetings at which some members of the Security Council are participating, as well as colleagues of other permanent missions, the membership of the United Nations in dealing with a specific issue, one which takes form or is restricted to what is strictly humanitarian in nature. Despite the very tragic situation we are considering, it is to a degree comforting that we are outside of all of the maelstrom of instructions, of country positions, of imposing sanctions, of studying mandates, of improving the wording in a paragraph, of giving a stronger, more robust or more extended mandate to a peacekeeping mission. All of these are tasks which we as diplomats are aware are very important, and we make our best effort in order to achieve products or outcomes which are favorable or satisfactory. But what I'm saying is that this particular issue is a comforting one in spite of its sorrowful nature. Why is that? Because it's a real case, a human one, one which we have come together to consider. For this reason, even though I have a few notes here to follow a thread of ideas, I would prefer to speak from the heart in a situation such as this one. This year, 2017, the second year in which Uruguay is participating as a member of the Security Council, gave us the opportunity to learn at first hand about the situation and the cases of Lieutenant Leah Golden, of Staff Sergeant Oren Shaul, and the cases of Abraham Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed. We had the opportunity of speaking with their relatives. We had a very sincere talk with Ms. Leah and her husband Simcha during the month of September, when they told us in great detail the circumstances of the capture of their son Hadar during his participation in the Protective Edge operation. In May, with my permanent mission, with my colleague Matthias, we were able to speak to Adia, the brother of Aaron Shaul. And about a month ago,
just over a month ago, we were able to meet Adarnesh, the mother of Avram Mengistu. And she told us about the difficulties they faced once they came from Ethiopia, when Avram was just a child. The sacrifices they had to make in order to adopt the customs of their new society, adapt to their new environment. And most unfortunately, when the oldest brother, Michael, died, Avera suffered from enormous instability, emotional imbalance, which inadvertently led him to cross from the state of Israel to the territory of Gaza. A very similar case to that of Hisham al-Sayed. Human Rights Watch describes the extended detention of Avera Mengistu, this Jew of Ethiopian origin, and Hisham al-Sayed of Bedouin origin, as cruel and indefensible. As those who spoke previously appropriately said, the situation we are facing, both when it comes to the case of the two soldiers and the two civilians, are clearly against the convention's ruling, which are the rules of war, which began in the 20th century with the Hague Convention of 1907, the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and all of the provisions of international humanitarian law, which cover the waging of modern warfare. As we are well aware, for Muslims and for Jews especially, the family's grief, the family's period of mourning does not come to an end until the customary funerary rites take place. And this is why, not just as a diplomat, but as a representative of a country and as a father myself, I perfectly understand the sorrow and the enormous pain which moves the families of Hadar and Oron. I would like to stress, and it seems important to me that we all be aware of the decision of the Supreme Court of Israel on the immediate return of the mortal remains of soldiers and fighters of both parties to the conflict. It is very sad to use dead bodies as bargaining chips, something which should not happen. Military commanders, as a tribute to those with them, should speak to the political class of each one of their countries, so that without any further discussion there will be an immediate understanding that once there are losses, once there are fallen, once there are mortal remains of soldiers fallen in combat, that these remains be immediately returned. If these soldiers were good subordinates when it came to following orders, then, without questioning those orders, because this is, after all, a good part of the light of a good army officer, a good subordinate, then they should also side with the families who expect the return of their closest family members, of their children. A democracy like Israel, with an independent justice system and an independent judiciary, was able to express itself in this regard just a few days ago. And as a democracy, too, where there is a free press, there has been abundant space dedicated to this issue. We have great expectations that with the return of the Palestinian National Authority to the government and the management of the Gaza Strip, that there will very soon be positive news about this very painful situation. To conclude, allow me to read what I said at meeting 845 of the month of September this year, when we dealt with the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. And I quote, "Every time the Security Council meets to consider this issue, we have stressed the need to drop the rhetoric of hatred and incitement to violence. Peace will be achieved through negotiation. One way of preparing the path to peace, we repeat, is through gestures. Besides drawing away from hatred, the relations between the two contenders must be humanized, and the fallen enemies' bodies must be returned. Thus, for example, the families of Lieutenant Hadar Goldin and Staff Sergeant Aren Shaul have been waiting since 2014 to give a dignified burial to their loved ones." Thank you very much, sir.
I thank the representative of Uruguay for his statement. Let me now read out the list of following speakers: Sweden, Japan, Italy, Ethiopia, Russia, and France. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I thank Dr. Golden and Professor Kotler for their compelling briefings. I would like to thank Dr. Golden in particular for sharing her personal story with us today. The loss of a child is the greatest fear of any parent. To be denied the opportunity after such a loss to lay one's child to rest is particularly cruel. I hope that you'll be able to lay your son to rest one day soon. Mr. Chair, the enforced disappearance of persons during conflicts is a matter of great concern to my government. The anguish and uncertainty borne by families of persons who go missing under these circumstances are compelling reasons to underline the international norms and principles that apply and should be respected, in Gaza as elsewhere. International law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law, is the fundamental framework within which the important issue at hand must be approached. All detained persons must be treated humanely and in accordance with human rights and international humanitarian law as applicable. Each party to the conflict must take all feasible measures to account for persons reported missing as a result of armed conflict and must provide their family members with any information it has on their fate. The personal details of persons deprived of their liberty must be recorded. Parties to the conflict must endeavor to facilitate the return of the remains of the deceased upon the request of the party to which they belong or upon the request of their next of kin. Doing so can bring an end to the unbearable uncertainty of family members. Mr. Chair, humanitarian organizations have an important role to play in relation to missing persons. However, in order for these organizations to have the possibility to fulfill their mandate, including regarding missing persons, humanitarian principles must be respected and humanitarian access must be guaranteed by all parties to a conflict in accordance with international humanitarian law. The ongoing closure and related restrictions of the Gaza Strip effectively restrict international humanitarian organizations' access and action in Gaza. Mr. Chair, the broader picture must not be forgotten. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is extremely serious, with repercussions for the security situation in and around Gaza. It is in the interest of all parties to alleviate the situation. The only way to reach sustainable peace and security in the region is through a negotiated two-state solution. Our collective efforts toward that end are more important than ever. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sweden for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Golden and Professor. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, I'd like to thank the briefers, Dr. Golden and Professor Kotler for your briefing and sharing with us personally your heartbreaking stories, truly heartbreaking stories. And I'd like to express my deepest sympathy to Dr. Golden and the family of the missing and the captive persons held in Gaza. No parents, I repeat, no parent should go through the pain that you are going through. Japan has a very principled position against violence. We condemn any acts, incitement, and glorification of violence, as it is fundamentally opposed to peaceful resolution of conflict. And Japan is concerned that the issue is yet to be resolved since the 2014 conflict in Gaza. Japan stresses the importance of acting in the spirit of humanity, and ignoring this spirit only risks deterioration of the situation, making complex problems even more intractable. In this regard, Hamas should provide relevant information on the status of the missing and the captive persons in Gaza as a first step towards the resolution of the issue. Mr. Chair, the issue at hand has larger implications too. It creates tension, hates toxic rhetoric, and makes Israeli-Palestinian peace harder to achieve. Japan will continue to work with the partners in the international community to facilitate just and enduring peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Ambassador. I wish to thank the Ukrainian and US delegation for convening this meeting. You know, I have not the same privilege of other colleagues in the Security Council to express myself in my own languages, I think, to my friend Luison, my neighbor on the left. And when we have to say something very important for you, that touch for you, you need your own languages. So I will not be so elaborate like Luis was, but I have strongly souvenir of the meeting that we had with Dr. Golden in my delegation 2 years ago. I had the privilege to meet her with her husband, the twin brother of Hadar, and we talked a lot about their incredible history, their very sad history. Once again, I can extend our full solidarity to the Golden family, as well as the other families who also ones are currently missing. But we have to be very clear. The fact that after 2 years we are still here in a room like this, speaking about this case, is a failure for all of us. It's a call to responsibility for all of us. We have seen also recently, during the work of the Security Council, meeting call for other important human rights lack of respect. I don't want to elaborate which one. But I think this is a basilar cases, cases of not respect, not only of all the humanitarian international law, conflict law, etc. The basic right of human being. And this is why my country attaches the utmost importance to the respect of international human rights, then the human rights law, especially in conflict situations. We have enjoyed more than 7 decades of peace, thanks to the process that happens in Europe. But my country was, for centuries, a basis of very sad conflicts. So we know what does it mean to be in a situation like this, to also to fight for your freedom, for your country, for your families. Of course, kidnapping, with all the remaining of those killed, are clear violation. The special last one, the most cruel violation, it's part of the Jewish culture, it's part of the Christian culture, it's part of the whole culture to respect the body of your dear. Preserving the dignity and humanity of all is a common goal of international human rights and humanitarian law, and there is a set of protection to persons in conflict that are supposed to be respected. With particular regard to missing persons and forced disappearance, the Geneva Convention, their additional protocol, provides specific obligations concerning the recording of information about persons deprived of their liberties. Even when this situation occurs, the international humanitarian law requires all parties, and I want to underline, when we say all parties, that means both state and non-state actors. This is very important to remember. To take every possible measure to shed light on the fate of the missing person. So what we can do? First, we call on those who have some influence on Hamas to make every attempt again and again and again to persuade the group to reserve its current course and comply with international humanitarian law. It will be hard, but first and foremost, we have to call to them. And in general terms, we believe that there is no justification whatever for the continued sentiment, the acts of violence and terror, including the launch of rockets from the Gaza territory. I wish to underline that strengthened accountability mechanisms are also crucial in order to promote enhanced compliance with international humanitarian law, and Italy has always been at the forefront of efforts to avoid impunity. I had no privilege to speak in Italian, but for the meeting that we had, I'm sure, Dr. Golden, that you believe in our determination to give you all the respect of your right. And thank you again for calling this meeting. It's a good way to end our year of presence in the Security Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to start by thanking the co-hosts, Ukraine and the United States, for organizing this meeting on the protection of missing and captive persons under international humanitarian law. I want to also express appreciation to both briefers for their presentation. It is indeed painful to hear a mother not being able to trace and recover the remains of a son, and when what she encounters is indifference. I would like to express a heartfelt sympathy to the families of the soldiers and the two missing persons. I wish also to thank the briefers for bringing the focus the situation of Avera Mengistu. We heard last month from Avera Mengistu's mother and family members the anguish they are going through since Avera crossed to Gaza and went missing in September 2014. He was not even a soldier, though even he were one, he would still have had the claim to be treated humanly under international humanitarian and human rights law. Thus, all the parties involved, including Hamas, have the obligation to ensure protection is extended not only to civilians like Avera, but also former combatants who are now powerless to cause harm. Civilians must also be treated humanly, as humanly as possible in all circumstances without distinction, and should be provided with their necessary needs, including medical treatment, and their rights should be upheld at all times. It is important, as already said, for all the parties involved to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law, particularly on the treatment of former soldiers of the other parties under their custody, tracing of the missing, and re-establishing family links, as well as return of the dead to their families, as well as proper treatment of the dead. As such, it would be important for Hamas to explore the possibility of using the good offices of an impartial party such as the ICRC or a third country to address these issues in line with its obligation under international humanitarian and human rights law. When we come to the case of Avera Mengistu, a young Israeli of Ethiopian Jewish origin, the issue becomes even more important. He is a young person with disability and, from all indications, was not aware of where he was and where he was heading. He stumbled by accident into an area where it was dangerous for him. He was captured by Hamas in 2014. International humanitarian law requires parties to an armed conflict to take all the feasible measures to account for persons reported missing or detained and to provide the necessary information on their fate to their family members in accordance with international humanitarian law. We, however, note with concern that no information was provided on the situation of Avera Mengistu to his family, and no family link was re-established. It is also of concern that so far no visit was conducted to assess the situation of Avera Mengistu. What we hope would happen and make the necessary effort in that direction is Hamas, perhaps with the support of the Palestinian Authority, to provide access to an independent, impartial, and neutral humanitarian organization such as the ICRC or a third country to visit Avera Mengistu with a view to ensuring that he has been treated humanly and that his fundamental rights are respected. I would also like to underline the importance of taking all the necessary measures to re-establish family contact by providing information and facilitating tracing activities. Of course, I have refrained from getting into the broader political issues concerning Israel and Palestine for two reasons. Firstly, frankly, there should be time when we should give space for basically humanitarian issues that should bring all together on account of our common humanity. Secondly, our position is fairly known and requires no further elaboration, particularly now when we are called upon to respond to issues that affect our common humanity. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
We'd like to thank the organizers of this meeting. This is indeed very important to draw attention to such serious and sensitive humanitarian issues. We note that unfortunately the echo of the military activities in 2014 is still sounding and resounding with pain in the hearts of many people. We are convinced that the resolution of all, even such sensitive issues, will become possible within the framework of the renewed political process and direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Thank you. I would like to first of all greet the meetings and thank Ms. Leah Golden for her ceaseless battle and for the strength for her testimony today with us today. We received the Golden family here in the French mission and also in the embassy in Tel Aviv, and of course we are following developments very closely. I would like to also thank Professor Kotler for his very precise statement. The question that we are tackling today is very grave in all meaning of the words. The consistent practice of keeping the remains of a fallen soldier in order to be able to exchange them in return for the release of prisoners or other benefits, whatever they may be, is unacceptable. And it is, of course, first of all, unacceptable in human and moral terms. It prevents families from mourning and instrumentalizes their pain for political and military ends. But this practice is also contradictory to international humanitarian laws, which imposes on combatants the duty to treat the remains with dignity, identify them to the extent possible, and return them to families. I would like to quote Article 17 of the Geneva Convention, 120 and 124 from the Third and the Fourth Convention, 34th from the additional protocol, and the Article 2 from General Assembly, a resolution which recalls all of these obligations. We can't accept the excuse of the specific context used by one of the combatants in order to feel themselves free of these obligations. That's why we demand that the bodies of Lieutenant Leah Golden and Sergeant Oren shall be immediately and unconditionally returned to their families. Similarly, the kidnapping of civilians by combatants and keeping them in captivity without without any judicial proceedings in order to use them as a bargaining chip within the context of an armed conflict is equally unacceptable. It strikes our conscience, all the more so in the case of Abraham Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed, because this benefits from psychological fragility and exploits it cynically for tactical ends. Once again, we'd like to underscore that above and beyond the moral feeling, these practices are against the most fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, in particular the principle of distinction, which requires to make a distinction between the civilian and military targets and not to intentionally target the civilians. There, once again, we demand an immediate and unconditional release of the Israeli civilians in Gaza so as to return them to their families and enable them to receive the medical care that they need. We do not have contacts with the Hamas. This is a movement, as everyone knows, is on the list of terrorist organizations of the European Union. This means that we make sure that our humanitarian aid to Gaza never goes through Hamas. This also means that our levers are limited and we cannot send a direct message to this Islamist movement. We urge everyone who has contacts and who has influence on their leaders to convey clearly and regularly this message. We condemn the practice of kidnapping and holding hostage of persons living or dead, as well as the firing of rockets and mortars against Israeli territory more frequently in the recent days, and this is also a violation of the principle of distinction. We also condemn the building of a tunnel for the purposes of carrying out kidnappings in Israel. All of these things can lead to an escalation and that thus hit both civilian populations. In the end, the solution in Gaza lies in the return of the Palestinian Authority and the resumptions of security control of this territory by the legitimate government forces of the Palestinian Authority. The agreement in Cairo on the 12th of October is an important step in this direction. Resuming control of the crossing points by the Palestinian authorities pursuant to this agreement is an encouraging development. This needs to be followed with further advances, in particular when it comes to pay the public sector employees in Gaza. But this process also has to lead to the improvement of the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which is hitting the Palestinian population of this territory and not Hamas. The resolution of the energy crisis underway in Gaza, in particular, has to be a priority. Let's say clearly that Hamas is very cynically exploiting the situation in Gaza. The deterioration of the humanitarian situation will not lead this movement to release their hold on Gaza. Maintaining and compounding of the humanitarian crisis, quite to the contrary, makes a particularly young population into a nursery for movements. We therefore call for the lifting of obstacles to freedom of movement towards and from Gaza, which is to be accompanied by appropriate security guarantees extended to Israel. And lastly, in the context of of our statement today, we need to recall the importance of implementing of all of the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law in the Palestinian territories, including Gaza, and more specifically, the Fourth Geneva Convention in the occupied territory. We also underscore that the practice of keeping the bodies of deceased, be they military or civilian, has to be banned by all parties, whatever the circumstances of death, and even when they are not kept for the purposes of carrying out an exchange. I would like to end by expressing the wish that in the immediate future, the pain of the families of those detained in Gaza, living and dead, will end soon. But in the long term, this is to be done through their release. And in the long term, that we see realized and benefit both peoples a promise of a just and lasting peace within the framework of two states, with Jerusalem as capital of the two states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished ambassador of Senegal.
Mr. President, co-presidents, rather, I'd like to thank the delegations of the United States and the Ukraine for the initiative of organizing this morning's Area Formula meeting. The advantage of the area formula is that it makes it possible for us to make national statements establishing national positions. This also makes it possible for the Security Council to hear individuals, organizations, which can contribute to the considerations the Security Council must make for the purposes of action. This morning, when I heard our briefers, Ms. Leah Golden, who is going through one of the most noble and difficult struggles one can think of. How long have her sons' remains, ever since rather, her sons' remains were found in Gaza. The three monotheistic religions prohibit what is happening. The return of the remains of a child, of a deceased person, to their family to receive a proper burial this is a noble cause. That you've touched the hearts of all of those present today, and you have touched, in particular, my own heart very deeply. The Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the most tragic, most cruel ones, beyond the military confrontations and the political issues at stake. There are so many heartbreaking individual events taking place. But they are unfolding in generalized indifference and can even be forgotten if nothing is done as we have done this morning. This is why the delegation of Senegal responded to the invitation of our colleagues of Ukraine and the United States. And this is why we are here, to listen to those who bear witness. Professor Erwin Kotler said everything that has to be said from the viewpoint of international law. All parties, to return to the expression of my colleague from Italy, both non-state and state actors have a duty to ensure that international humanitarian law is properly observed. This is why, on such an occasion, my delegation bows its head in the memorial of the victims of conflict and reiterates its solemn commitment to do its utmost as a member of the Security Council and as a member state to condemn violence, to condemn terrorism, acts of abduction and kidnapping, no matter who the authors and no matter what the motives may be. Hearing from our colleague of Ethiopia, one of whose citizens was most unfortunately kidnapped. Abraham or Avera Mengistu was abducted, and so is Hisham al-Sayed. What this brings to mind is that a dose of empathy, of fellow feeling, is a way of helping to find the path towards a solution.
un nombre de fois.
It is my hope, Ms. Golden, that your fight, your struggle, will make it possible to move mountains.
Cette réunion nous offre aussi l'occasion
This meeting also offers us the possibility of considering the situation in Gaza, one of the most difficult situations. Now that thanks to Egyptian efforts, in part, the Palestinian Authority, or rather the factions of the Palestinian Authority have reconciled, it is our hope that negotiations between Israel and Palestine will be undertaken in order to make a progress towards the two-state solution. And if progress is achieved, it is our hope that those people who are detained will be released, and that the mortal remains of those who fell will be returned to their families. This is why Senegal makes an appeal to all those who have influence on the parties to the conflict to redouble their efforts to help ensure that passions give place to feeling for the other. Peace is possible between Israelis and Palestinians. Peace must come between Israel and the Palestinians in order for the two states, the State of Israel and the State of Palestine, to be able to coexist in peace and security for the stability not only of the Middle East but of the entire world. Thank you very much, sir.
I thank the representative of Senegal for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. On behalf of my mission, I'd like to thank the U.S. mission and the Ukrainian mission for arranging this very important session. And I'd like to thank Professor Kotler and Dr. Golden for their briefing. And I think that I consider it personally, these briefings, these speeches were very deep and very touching. And I will not be repeating after the delegations, and they raised very important issues, but I will focus on this issue, specific on this issue, and this issue is very important, and it must be important to all of us. Humanitarian law must be respected and implemented by all, including Hamas. And our moral duty to help all families, including these Israeli families, to have their children back and hug them again. And the detainees must be returned home safe and sound. Kazakhstan against all kidnappings and other violations of humanitarian law. And I express my sympathy to you, dear Ms. Golden, and I can barely imagine the pain through you are making your life every day. And that must be treated properly and given back to their families. This is also the demand of Islam. And thank you again for giving me the floor.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for his statement. Now I would like to ask, are there any other delegation wishing to take the floor? I have Israel, Peru, Canada, and Germany, and I give the floor to the distinguished ambassador of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the permanent missions of Ukraine and the United States for hosting this area formula. I would also like to thank former Minister of Justice, Professor Erwin Kotler of Canada, founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and Dr. Leah Golden, mother of Second Lieutenant Hadar Goldin. May today's discussion serve as a litmus test to determine the unconditional mercy, empathy, and humanity of these United Nations. And may that litmus test ignite real, swift, and deliberate action on the ground. I would like the members of this Council to take a moment. In that moment, I would like you to think of this discussion not in your role as distinguished diplomats. Assume your role as a mother, a father, an uncle, an aunt, or a grandparent. I would like you to think of these 4 boys not as casualties and captives whose lives are reduced to numbers. Think of them as your family, with names, friends, hobbies, and big dreams. The crisis we are debating today requires the utmost empathy and concern for human life. Over 3 years ago, as Hamas rockets streamed into Israel from the skies, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire. Israel respected this ceasefire. Hamas did not. It took Hamas just an hour and a half to deliberately and violently defy the ceasefire. Israeli soldiers were on a routine patrol when Hamas terrorists emerged from a tunnel. The terrorists killed 3 of the soldiers, taking the remains of one of them back into the tunnel. The young man's name was Hadar Goldin. Look Leah Golden in the eyes. Explain to this mother why she has had to wait 3 long years and still has no answers. 3 long years to give her son the respect and dignity of a proper burial. Less than 2 weeks prior, Hamas killed and took hostage another young man. The terrorists then celebrated their kidnapping on live TV. They had within them the pure evil, the sickness to sing a song mocking the grief of this young man's family. That young man's name was Oron Shaul. The fall of 2014 brought even more tragedy. Another young man who suffered from mental illness crossed the border into Gaza. He was seized by Hamas. Hamas was so cruel that it refused to provide even a sign of life to this man's terrified family. This young man, a civilian, held illegally in Gaza, is Avera Mengistu. A 4th young man faced similar sickening fate a year later. Hamas knows full well that this man suffered from mental illness. The 4th young man is Hisham El-Sayad. Hamas has stolen 4 of our sons. Hamas has proven once again its disregard for human life. Hamas has made clear that it is not bothered whatsoever by the agony and unrelenting grief of the mothers and fathers of these young men. There is no equivalence here. These young men have paid a sick and unjust price. They have been robbed of life. We acknowledge the constant threat of Hamas that still pledges our society. But as parents who send our children to defend our country, our pain is even more personal. Too many parents are buried their children. So today, I urge you to think about this tragedy not as a matter of security, but as one of humanity. Put your politics aside and help us bring our boys home. The UN as a legal and moral obligation to pressure Hamas and its unity government partner, the Palestinian Authority, to release Hisham and Avera and return the bodies of Oron and Adar. Today, I am also going to provide you with a religious obligation. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, honoring those who have died through proper burial and mourning is central to practice. It is said in the Bible that when a person passes away, he should be, and I quote, gathered with his people and buried with his fathers. According to the Islamic tradition, the believers must wash the body of the deceased and bury it as soon as possible. The religious obligations are clear. No one can ignore them. With no second thoughts, with no hesitation, with no respect for humanity, Hamas has broken international law. It has debased human rights. It has turned the Geneva Conventions into a laughingstock. Hamas terrorists are holding the remains of these young soldiers. They are holding hostage civilians whose only crime was to cross a border by mistake. They are denying the families the basic human dignity, the basic human morality of laying their loved ones to rest. It has been 3 years. 4 Israeli boys are held in captivity by an internationally recognized terrorist organization. Let me be clear. Israel will not rest until our boys are returned home, and neither should you. We all want to improve the lives of the residents of Gaza. In fact, it is Israel that is doing more than any other country in the world to alleviate their situation. But this same compassion for human rights must go both ways. The international community cannot let this mistreatment of Israelis go on, not even 1 day longer. We must demand the immediate release of all Israelis by Hamas. We must keep our promise to right this horrible wrong. We must stand fiercely against Hamas and hold it accountable for its illegal actions. And we must bring our boys home. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished ambassador of Peru.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to thank the representatives of Ukraine and the United States for having organized this important meeting. A few weeks ago, at the mission of Peru, we met with the parents of Leah Golden, who are here today. And at that time, we heard their heartbreaking story, as well as the story of other families in Israel who are suffering in this difficult situation because of violence and the disregard of fundamental international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Peru condemns all violations of the international standards ruling over us, in this particular case by Hamas. These violations are unjustifiable in any political setting, and all they do is create obstacles to a peaceful solution in the region, the solution we have always longed for, that of mutual respect, where tolerance, mutual respect, and empathy have pride of place. Peru calls, once again, on all parties involved to moderate their actions and to guide them towards a constructive dialogue and a framework of international respect and respect for international humanitarian law. These standards give us a minimum obligatory basis to limit certain unacceptable practices which harm the dignity of individuals and of the international community as a whole. Actions such as those which have brought us together today cannot be tolerated. They must not be tolerated because they are an affront to the basic rules of human coexistence. During its participation in the Security Council, starting in January next year, Peru will stress the need for full respect of these international standards, as well as giving a new sense of urgency to the efforts of the entire international community to put an end to the tragic situation in the Middle East, which has taken so many innocent families as the victims, including the Golden family, to whom we express our full solidarity and support until such time as their loved ones can finally rest in peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Peru for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Canada.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I would like to thank the two organizers of this meeting this morning, the United States and Ukraine. I would like to also thank the panelists who provided us with information that was necessary and convincing, which should be a call of alarm to everyone who listened to them.
Israel's right to live in peace with its neighbors within secure boundaries, and we recognize Israel's right under international law to take the necessary measures in accordance with human rights and international humanitarian law to protect the security of its citizens from attack. Unfortunately, actions taken to safeguard Israel's security have come at a great cost. Staff Sergeant Shaw and Second Lieutenant Golden's death in 2014 represent tragic losses. We would like to offer, again, our sincere condolences to the families. We deplore that their suffering is needlessly prolonged when they are denied the ability to mourn, honor, and lay their loved ones. We demand that their remains be returned to their families. We believe that all parties must fully respect international human rights and humanitarian law. This is the key to building a climate conducive to achieving the just and lasting peace to which we aspire. Keeping captives and the remains of fallen soldiers is no way to pursue peace. Canada closely follows any developments in these cases. We welcome today's session, and Canada wishes to stand in solidarity with the families. To quote the former Canadian Minister of Justice, Kotler, whom we've heard from today, we wish to tell you, you are not alone. And I would like to end by mentioning the fact that I've been informed that a petition will be presented to the Secretary General today that has been signed by 15,000 Canadians for the return of your sons. Merci beaucoup.
I thank the representative of Canada for her statement, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Dr. Golden and Professor Kotler for speaking to us today, as well as to Ukraine and the United States of America for hosting this timely, open, area formula meeting on the humanitarian aspect of missing and captive persons in Gaza. The moving presentation by Dr. Golden was a stark reminder of what this tragedy means for a family. And at the same time, I would say that we probably all can hardly imagine how tragic the loss of a son so early in his life must have been for your entire family. With incredible strength, you have campaigned tirelessly, both in Israel and internationally, to keep your son's plight on the agenda. I can assure you Germany takes these cases of missing and captive persons in Gaza very seriously. Withholding information about missing persons and withholding the human remains of the deceased, these are grave violations of international humanitarian law, and they are completely unacceptable and intolerable. And apart from the legal aspects, we are horrified that the loss of families involved is being instrumentalized as a political bargaining chip. All this is deeply inhumane. Keeping a family in limbo this way amounts to one of the cruelest forms of torture. Those responsible should know that their actions do not only undermine the bare minimum of human interaction in times of conflict, they also make it impossible to be accepted as serious interlocutors for engaging in a serious effort to finding peace. They must be held accountable, and they must be brought to justice. You brought the cases presented here today to the attention of our colleagues in Tel Aviv, New York, and Berlin. And as you know, we do not engage directly with terrorist organizations such as Hamas, but we do have committed to address these cases with those of our partners who do and have influence in the region, and to pass on the message that this behavior is inhumane and unacceptable. Germany calls for the unconditional and immediate return of the human remains of Second Lieutenant Golden and Staff Sergeant Oron Shaul. And we would like to take this occasion to once again refer to a very basic obligation under humanitarian law, that persons captured alive must be accounted for and be treated humanely, and that human remains too must be treated with dignity, identified and returned to the families concerned. Germany will continue to support the international humanitarian organizations mandated to provide answers and hopefully solutions to the burning questions of the concerned families. Let me assure you, we are with you in words and we are with you in deeds, and we will do everything in our powers that these barbarian practices are stopped. We need to reinforce cooperation towards this goal at all levels and in all organizations, including in the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for his statement. This brings my list of speakers to an end. If there are no more delegations wishing to take the floor, I would like to give the floor for the final remarks to you, and to our both briefers, and to the co-organizer, United States. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. As a family, we would like to thank you for all your remarks, for your support, and we really trust you as a member state of the United Nations to take our case on your agenda and look for ways to resolve it. Just two closing comments. We, the Golden family, represent the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know, we have the twin boys that went to fight in Gaza. One of them rescued Palestinian families caught between fire once they was used as human shields. And that Sur and Hadar is captured by the same Hamas, the same Palestinians. And I think this actually represents the we as a family can show the real conflict. Now, this war, I mean, all the war of Israel, specifically this one, actually, I would like to remind you that it started with thousands of missiles shot from Gaza on Israel. And as we live near Tel Aviv, we got telephone from our kids, especially Hadar, asking, "How are you doing, Mom?" And I said, "How are you doing?" before he was killed, of course. Now, what we are looking now, especially in this humanitarian discussion, is to ask and to seek and ask your help to give us, the Israelis, our humanitarian rights. You know, I think it's the first time Israel is involved in such an area formula, raising an Israeli issue. Israel is known for giving a lot of humanitarian support all over the world. Israel is the first one to reach every earthquake, every disaster, to submit help. especially with the IDF, which is the most moral army in the world. So now I understand all the other things in the world. We are not political people. We are just a family. And we are looking to receive our humanitarian life in bringing Hadar home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Mr. Kotler, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate the interventions by the members of the Security Council and the member delegates this morning, which have anchored their remarks in the standing violations of international humanitarian law by Hamas, the cruel refusal to provide information on the missing and the deceased as required by law, and the standing and inhumane refusal to return the remains of Hadar Golden and Oren Shaul for proper and decent burial as required not only by international humanitarian law, but by the dictates of all the religions heretofore mentioned and to which we subscribe. We appreciate also, and no less important, the moving recognition by delegates here of the pain and suffering, the torture and torment of the families which have humanized the notion of international humanitarian law, which have put a face and an identity on what otherwise might appear to be, though necessary, abstract principles. But I have to say, and with this I close, that while condemnation of these ongoing violations of international humanitarian law are welcome, action, international action, to remedy these violations, to hold the violators accountable, and to secure the immediate release of the remains of Hadar Golden and Oren Shaul and repatriated to Israel, and the immediate return of the missing is as urgent as it is necessary. The United Nations and its member states and institutions, as trustees of international law, as enforcers of the principles of international humanitarian law and of international peace and security. And I share the moving comments made today about the importance of the pursuit of peace and security. We have a responsibility to act with all deliberate speed, to secure justice, to put an end to the agonizing pain and suffering, torture and torment of the families, a responsibility which we all pledge to support and implement until justice and humanity are effectively secured. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, as many of us probably noticed as we came in this morning, it's a somewhat quieter time in New York. It's a somewhat quieter time at the UN today. As the end of year approaches, there's a certain stillness that is starting to settle in. So it's our hope in this relative quiet, in this relative moment of stillness, that our heartfelt messages today are going to come through even more clearly to the rest of the world. One, the message of outrage that we've heard today from so many member states, from so many parts of the world, regarding terrorist organization Hamas's cruel and callous use of human beings as bargaining chips. And two, the message of heartfelt solidarity with the families of the missing and of the captive. So many of us are going to enjoy precious time with our own beloved family members in the coming days. But I think it was very appropriate that we came together here in this chamber as the end of the year approaches, to be reminded that these families are cruelly deprived not only of their family members, but of peace of mind. But as you can see, Dr. Golden, you are not alone. We are with you in sympathy and in solidarity. So I want to thank you, Dr. Golden. I want to thank you, Professor Kotler, and all of the colleagues for being here with us this morning to focus not only on this very important humanitarian issue, but as Professor Kotler has reminded us, on this call for action. Thank you, Vladimir.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to all of you for your contributions and participation in today's ARIA Formula meeting. My special thanks, of course, go to the briefers, and our full sympathies are with you and your family. I believe that the discussion we had today is timely and extremely important. I would like to underline that the issue of missing or captive personnel is very pertinent for each and every conflict. I was touched by the stories we heard today, and Ukraine does share your pain. For us Ukrainians, this subject is especially close and important in light of the ongoing armed aggression against our country. As we speak, there are over 150 Ukrainian citizens held hostage by the separatists in eastern Ukraine, and over 50 Ukrainians that are imprisoned in Russia on political motives. On the eve on the holiday season, it is important to remember about these people and about all other people who cannot be with their families. Let us do everything possible and let us put an extra effort in order to return them to their families. The families of Hadar and Oron are waiting for far too long. As the distinguished colleague from Israel has said, let us put politics aside to achieve this. I think that this is the right thing to do, and this is a humane thing to do, and after all, it is our professional duty. That is why we felt strongly about organizing this ARIA meeting. We hope that this issue will continue to be addressed in the United Nations. I'm personally convinced that its ultimate solution in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will represent the necessary and highly needed confidence-building measure that will be a stepping stone towards the long-awaited progress in the Middle East peace process. We all need it so much. And finally, I would like to wish all of you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And I wish all our wishes and dreams come true. I thank you. The meeting is adjourned.